Good evening, everyone. I'm Liz Joyner, founder and president of the Village Square. On behalf of the Village Square and Florida Humanities, we're delighted you've joined us tonight for Resetting the Table, Wisdom from Conflict. This program is made possible by funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the United We Stand Connecting Through Culture initiative. It's part of a multi-year series of digital programs, UNUM, Democracy Reignited, presented in partnership with Florida Humanities, exploring the past, present, and future of the American idea as it exists on paper, in the hearts of our people, and as it manifests in our lives. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent Florida Humanities or National Endowment for the Humanities. If you are not familiar with the work of NEH and Florida Humanities, we're putting their web addresses in chat. Be sure to check them out. The chat window will be closed tonight, but you can ask questions at any time during the program by clicking on the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you haven't taken our pre-event survey yet, if you take just a moment to do so as we're getting rolling here, we're dropping the link into the chat thread so that you can participate in this nationally scoped effort to better understand divisions in the United States. Just answer the questions honestly. Even if you've done the survey for another program, we ask that you complete it again this time. We are delighted to welcome streaming partners, Bridge USA, USC Center for the Political Future, National Institute for Civil Discourse, Listen First Project, Common Ground Committee, Braver Angels, Civic Health Project, McCourtney Institute for Democracy, Unify, Talking Politics and Religion Without Killing Each Other, Podcast, Citizen Connect, Center for the Humanities at University of Miami, Network for Responsible Public Policy, and our wonderful long-term local partners, the Tallahassee Democrat and WFSU Public Media. It is now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest, Rabbi Melissa Weintraub, the founding co-CEO of Resetting the Table, an organization that works to equip leaders and communities from every corner of American life with tools and skills to overcome toxic polarization and build greater social cohesion in American life. Melissa is a veteran social entrepreneur and peacebuilder, having founded and built two nonprofit organizations that opened up transformative communication across divides, overcome dehumanization and distrust, and work towards a shared society in both the U.S. and Israel-Palestine. Melissa was awarded the Grinnell College Innovator for Social Justice Prize, which honors demonstrated leadership and extraordinary accomplishment in affecting social change. Melissa has lectured and taught in hundreds of universities, congregations, and forums on 4 continents. I don't think I've visited 4 continents. She was ordained as a conservative rabbi at the Jewish Theological Seminary and graduated from Harvard University summa cum laude. Through rigorous training, courageous dialogue, and empathy-generating media content, Resetting the Table equips Americans from all corners of American life to transform political differences into an engine of strength and relationship, creative problem solving, and collective insight. Resetting the Table has directly reached more than 75,000 Americans. Melissa, welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. Thanks, Liz.
I am really delighted that we've come to this evening. We've talked about it a lot this year, and I've already learned a lot from you, and I'm really excited that other people are going to do the same tonight.
And vice versa. I'm a big fan of Village Square and yours.
Thank you. Thank you. So let's start by talking about your personal story, including what called you to become a rabbi and led you to do work across deep divisions.
Absolutely. So I grew up in a smallish town in the Midwest, and there were more corn and soybean fields in my area than homes when we first moved in. And I was born into a Jewish liberal family with parents from the big city, from Chicago, in this kind of deep red, largely conservative Christian context. I remember seeing a mock election in my elementary school in which 22 students had voted for Reagan and 1 had voted for Mondale. And I was aware that for my extended family and my cousins in the Chicago area, they were in this kind of mirror image political context, essentially, surrounded by an inversion of that landscape. And so I think from the age of 9, ideological and regional rifts in America were already part of my consciousness, and I was already trying to translate on some level across them. And that produced what I sometimes think of as bifocal vision, this kind of being inside and outside at once of every context that I'm in, just always thinking about who's around this table and who's not around this table, and who's here, but they're not really coming to voice, and what do they really think? So that was, very much a disposition and lens of a bridger that I was bringing with me, and kind of produced a lifelong sensitivity to groupthink, including groupthink in the bridge building space, which I think we'll talk about some tonight, just wherever it pops up. And on the flip side, like really this lifelong drive to create opportunities to connect across differences and all the potential insight and creativity and healing that can emerge when we engage our differences and we do it well rather than poorly. So some of the childhood experiences that I had drove a strong connection to Israel. And, I had visceral experiences of anti-Semitism as a child, but also like given the kind of sensibility of a bridger, within a few days of being in Israel for the first time, I was just gravitationally pulled to Palestinian-Israeli dialogue. And within a few days of being in Israel, I was tagging along to English literature classes at the largest Palestinian university in the West Bank with new Palestinian friends, listening to Palestinians debating freedom and democracy and Palestinian political factions in a class on Chaucer and Beowulf, and just like sitting in the cafeteria, a sponge for people's voices and stories. And so I'll fast forward to 2004. It's definitely the middle of the story, but it's now 4 years into the Second Intifada, and it had become illegal for Israelis to enter Palestinian areas of the West Bank except in military uniform, and almost impossible for Palestinians to obtain permits to enter Israel. And so very few Palestinians or Jewish Israelis, including people who are professional peace builders, could have genuine cross-border relationships. And there are just so many obstacles to being able to do so: legal obstacles, physical obstacles, checkpoints, and a physical barrier, psychological obstacles, like it was seen as taboo, if not traitorous in both societies, to have contact. I'm speaking in the past tense, but this is still very much true today. There are just these kind of staggering psychological distances in this tiny geographic space because people a few miles apart can't meet and can't talk. And it had become common for my week to include studying traditional Jewish text in a rabbinical seminary in Jewish Jerusalem, birthday barbecues in Ramallah, meetings with Palestinian NGOs in Bethlehem, Shabbat dinners in religious Zionist communities. And I'd gotten to the point that I could go to a Jewish young leadership conference or a Palestinian young leadership conference and know as many people in each room, and see that in each of those rooms, people were mutually preoccupied, to say the least, but had very little actual contact with each other's basic humanity and lived experience. And so I kind of felt like I was living in the twilight zone, like many bridge builders before and after, and just trying to sustain genuine human connection with people that regarded each other at times as beyond sympathy, if not evil. And I co-founded another organization. This was prior to resetting the table, called Encounter, with my dear friend, Rabbi Miriam Margles, and a group of Palestinian young leaders that I'd met when we were all university students who had now risen to prominence as young leaders directing Palestinian organizations. And we began to dream of bringing everyone we knew to come and sit around that table with us, and especially targeting unusual suspects whose political or religious leanings may have deterred them from participating in other people-to-people initiatives, and especially people who leaned centrist or right of center and or religious. And we essentially imagined expanding by orders of magnitude this unique position that I'd been in. And essentially my life had become a bridge, and we just imagined, like, what if we brought thousands of people across it? And so that program, already on our first trip, was the most significant non-military Jewish presence in Palestinian areas of the West Bank since the start of the Second Intifada. And Encounter's alumni are among the most politically diverse groups ever to participate in this kind of peace building work. It's still to this day one of the strongest existing bridges between Jews and Palestinians. So I'll take us up through that point. We can talk about some of the pivots that led to resetting the table and to this moment. I think I didn't answer why I decided to become a rabbi, but maybe I'll.
Yeah, that I would like to hear
Okay.
that.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll say in a sentence. I wanted to be a scholar and an activist and a therapist all at once, and it was a way of doing all three.
Oh, that's really beautiful. That should be on the promo materials for becoming a rabbi. So there are just a couple of things that I want to maybe put a pin in for us to, that I relate to a lot in terms that you said. One is the bifocal vision. The way that I've described it is, those dot
Yes,
portraits, they have a name that if you focus differently, you see a different picture.
absolutely.
And that's very much what our work has been like. And you kind of go, oh, if you practice it, you start to be able to go, wait, this looks really different from that other perspective.
I love that metaphor.
Um,
Absolutely. And to hold the cognitive dissonance of that.
yeah, yeah. And it's kind of a different life experience to do that. And then also just your life had become a bridge. I think that is just beautiful, beautiful. And then maybe the other thing that we can swing back around to a little bit later is just the idea that we're not finding ourselves in the same spaces with people who disagree with us. I mean, we may not have laws that keep us from
Yes,
going into territory, but in some ways it's kind of the same. We really
absolutely.
relate to that because we're just going, just how do we get this diversity of people into the room? Because when you do, amazing things can happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think about that sometimes in the US that we don't have the same legal barriers, we don't have the same physical barriers, and yet 77% of Americans say that they don't have a friend who thinks differently than they do politically, right? And we're not
Yeah.
living with the same, I mean, there's plenty of historical trauma in the US, but most of us don't have bodies on the line and don't have the same level of losing loved ones to violent conflict in the same way, and yet we just have these tremendous psychological barriers.
We really do. We really do. So that makes a great way to pivot to this next question, which is, so your work was originally regarding relationships in the context of the conflict in the Middle East, but in the past decade, you've moved to a focus on the United States. Where were the pivots there along the way that led you on that path?
So the initial pivot, at some point we realized, and this was while still working on Israel-Palestine as the primary focus, that to get to greater security and dignity for both peoples, which is a very long horizon, Sisyphean, we were going to need peace building within our peoples, possibly every bit as much as between them. Like we needed peace building across ideological divides within the Jewish people. And we needed peace building across divides within the Palestinian people and among third parties engaging with this conflict from the outside and often intensifying it unwittingly, pouring lighter fluid on it. And that insight gave rise to Resetting the Table. And I co founded Resetting the Table with my husband, Eyal Rabinovich. That's maybe our greatest conflict resolution credential, that we're still running an organization together 10 years
I
later.
did not know that.
Oh, you didn't know that? Yeah. So Eyal is my husband. And initially we were exclusively focused on building less toxic, more generative dialogue and deliberation across political divides on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the US. So that was our niche focus. Working to overcome the proxy war around Israel-Palestine that plays out here. And now there's many more people who are aware of that proxy war, and we are still working on it. And we developed in the course of doing so a robust toolkit and methodology for helping people to be able to tackle their differences honestly and head on and come out the other side with stronger relationship and learning and collaboration, and to be able to in turn then build healthier and more resilient communities. And then in 2016, we had a wake-up call, like a lot of people who've done international peace building work, that the US was degenerating into its own intractable conflict and even violent confrontation, and that our tools were really desperately needed more broadly. And we pivoted to making societal conflict in the US our focus.
I'm so glad you did, and of course we need you. So what are, at resetting the table, what are your prescriptions? What are the ways you see out of the conflict cycle we're in now?
So, what are our prescriptions? So, I'm going to start at a very high altitude and say that, as we see it, there are no silver bullets. Like Peter Coleman, who I saw also spoke on here, talks about this as a cloud problem, not a clock problem. We're not just fixing one gear, right? And there's an array of interventions that are needed from a lot of different angles and different levels and in diverse communities. We need political and cultural interventions and elite and grassroots interventions, online and offline. And there are people, thankfully, working on structural reforms and people working on social media as a root cause and people working to restore trust in our core institutions like our elections. So we think all of these things matter and more, but that we could do all of these things and still have toxic polarization and not have a well-functioning and stable democracy. And we probably can't accomplish these things without also making culture change. And we focus on culture change. And we see massive perception gaps. And I'll talk about what perception gaps are. We see them as both a symptom and also a core driver of toxic polarization in the US. So we are living with this just massively distorted understanding of who our societal counterparts are, what they think and why, how they relate to us. We have these distortions in a particularly destructive way. We see our counterparts as much more hateful and extreme than they actually are. And this has been demonstrated again and again. So,
and just to emphasize what an extraordinary tragedy that is. Because we're not talking about signal differences. We're talking about a lot of noise, a lot of things that just simply are not true.
Yes. And that form a lot of distrust and perception of threat that then cause a whole cycle of conflict to ensue and a lot of other harms. So we see correcting distortion and misperception and distrust and that exaggerated understanding of our counterparts as threat as really mattering to addressing the underlying engines of destructive conflict and what gets us out of it. And when I talk about perception of threat, I don't mean that there aren't real threats, but we tend to exaggerate and distort the extent to which our counterparts are a threat. So we think that among the most important interventions are ones that just correct our skewed understanding of who the other is and help us find ways out of our bubbles that disrupt our us-them binaries, that reduce our fear of each other, our feelings of threat, and that increase our care and goodwill toward others, and also that help produce a sense of being part of something larger than ourselves and our own in-groups, and that include all of us without erasing our differences, what scholars sometimes call superordinate or cross-cutting identities. So the field of conflict theory, which some people who are watching may be familiar with some of this, but it's just amassed an enormous body of evidence that's backing a simple hypothesis that's pretty intuitive, which is that meaningful encounters across divides, even across lines of enmity, reduce distrust and reduce prejudice and increase empathy and respect, and even resilience against violence. There's a classic study of ethnic violence in India that investigated why did some cities in India produce Hindu-Muslim violence and some didn't, that were otherwise identical. And they found that the defining variable of the cities that didn't produce violence were organizations that brought Muslims and Hindus together in direct relationship, building cross-cutting identities and a shared sense of we that withstood politicians and radicalizing groups working to polarize them. And I think Northern Ireland is another example that is really instructive as a point of reference. There was an investment there in intergroup contact at scale that's credited with building enough of a peace infrastructure to get to tipping point and to pull that society out of its violent spiral. And the kind of work that we are both involved in and that our whole ecosystem doing bridge building is involved in, there was like just a massive investment in that work. The International Fund of Ireland invested more than $2 billion, $44 per person, in a proliferation of bridge building activities. And those activities built relationships between nationalist and unionist leaders and between Catholic and Protestant youth, and participation in those programs became a kind of rite of passage and mainstream, like rather than something that was only available to a small minority of people to opt into. And the leaders, Yeah.
And that's kind of a counterintuitive thing, the idea that, well, if we spent more time together doing more, had some common goals, that if, we're not sitting around a table necessarily, but we're stringing Christmas lights, we're building community centers. I think it's counterintuitive that makes a difference.
That it makes a difference for us to come
Yeah.
together across our differences.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah.
I think it's actually, our experience is it's actually easier than you think it is, but then we're not doing the things that make a difference.
Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely. We can come back to that, I think, many times tonight. The fear, right? The trepidation and the anxiety that people have about coming into the room, and then the ease with which their fatalism often comes undone once they're actually there, right?
It's beautiful.
Yeah. So maybe I'll throw in one more concept, because we talked about intergroup contact that I think will help contextualize some of the other things that we may talk about. So we at RTT also, in addition to intergroup contact, talk about a lesser known concept, which is intra-group norm building. So research also shows that, especially in societies like ours that are highly fractured, it's important to work within disparate groups to build practices for navigating differences. We are deeply influenced, all the more so in polarized contexts. So not only by the kind of perceived norms of like-minded groups, the groups we're part of. Like, another way to say this is we look to people like ourselves to determine what's socially acceptable, right? And then what we see, we tend to replicate, we tend to spread. If we see distrust and disdain, that's what we spread. If we see curiosity and respect, that's what we spread. So that idea has greatly shaped our approach at resetting the table. And we really believe that to overcome toxic divisions in our society alongside intergroup contact, we need to invest in healthy pluralism with those most proximate to us, in our workplaces, in our churches and faith communities, on our campuses, in our boardrooms. Like, we need to be kind of practicing these fractals of democracy. You could think about it in this kind of lived experience of communicating and collaborating across our differences wherever we are.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Fractals of democracy, just beautiful. So what does resetting the table actually do? Like, bring it down to the level of programmatically.
Great. Yeah. So we divide our activities into what we call a ground game and an air game. And the ground game, and it flows from some of the concepts that I was just talking about, means programs bringing people together for direct encounters across lines of difference, or I should say, or training community leaders. So people like faith leaders and campus professionals to build healthy engagement across divides for their own constituents. And when we have these perception gaps and people have demonized each other, projected all kinds of things onto each other, and what we have seen and observed and studied, like, there is no replacement for the transformative potential of direct human interaction. Like, that is what is going to undo our false assumptions. And at the same time, direct encounter often requires facilitation and expertise to set it up well, and that is notoriously difficult to scale. So one of our ancestors, that was an interesting slip. One of our answers to the question of scale is to primarily focus our ground game on training force multipliers, like people who are kind of shaping how others think and behave, and who can meet people where they are in their faith communities, in their workplaces, in their classrooms, so they don't have to sign up for a bridge building activity. They can manifest it where they are, right? Those fractals of democracy. And we train an exceptional diversity of people here, ideologically, racially, regionally, from deans at Liberty University, which is perhaps the epicenter of religious conservatism, to progressive DEI activists, to Farm Bureau leaders in rural Wisconsin, to prominent journalists. And even with all kind of the downstream impacts that we get through the work of these leaders, and I would say the parallel work of our whole ecosystem, right? Village Square and hundreds of organizations, we're arguably still reaching much too small a percentage of Americans to get to tipping point change and be able to turn the tide in our country. So enter what we call air game. And by air game, we mean TV shows, films, video games, social media content that is aimed at shifting our communal and national storylines at scale. So we created a short film called Purple that I think you circulated as part of your publicity for tonight, that's reached more than 100,000 people in public libraries and high schools and universities and museums. But the core of our air game actually is less making content than catalyzing it. So we train Hollywood showrunners and writers and producers who reach millions with their content, with the understanding that they could essentially play the role of societal translators. Like, they could help lift us all out of our bubbles to cross those psychic distances that we've been talking about as background and viewpoint, and help us to be able to see each other again across our streams and identities. And, like we said a little earlier, not everybody's going to participate in an intergroup encounter, but millions could have vicarious contact with their counterparts through film and TV and magazine stories and even video games, and see each other with greater humanity and accuracy.
I mean, in many ways, good art, good entertainment is really about understanding other humans.
Absolutely. Yeah, we say to the TV writers that we're working with or that we're trying to recruit, this is just good storytelling, right? We're not trying to get you to sell spinach, right? Like, this is good popcorn, because like, what everybody is just so hungry to see their thing depicted on TV. Like, they want to see relatable characters and storylines that speak to their everyday lives.
When I think about, again, really good storytelling, characters are complex, right? They're not two-dimensional. You can see, it's like you feel, some challenge, loving them. And then there's something that they do that makes you love them, kind of. So I mean, I would think that it's kind of that kind of depth of story that humanizes people in a multi-dimensional way.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so much of good storytelling is like the metaphor that you used earlier, right? Like, being able to initiate people into the ability to see the same picture through different perspectives, the dots, right? To be able to see the same, like, through a kind of multivocal lens. You can see it through different characters' eyes. And so much good storytelling is also about conflict. And as our entertainment director, who is herself a content creator, she says, good storytelling is about conflict and catharsis. And she doesn't like to call it healthy conflict because it evokes spinach. And entertainment people don't like spinach. They want the popcorn, but it is about generative conflict, like people going through their differences and coming out the other side with healing and stronger relationship.
Yeah, you've done work with some extraordinary, very, very, very well-known, well-watched shows. Can you, is that super secret, or can you share what some of that is?
Yeah, we can do a little name dropping, but we have worked with TV writers from Grey's Anatomy and Handmaid's Tale and Sense8 and Mad Men, and lots of the most popular shows on television.
That is just so cool. So cool. And also for folks in our field who just love Amanda Ripley and High Conflict, you all were a catalyst. Your story is told in that, and you're a catalyst for the initiative Complicating the Narrative.
Yes. So I saw in some of the publicity you described some work that we did in rural Wisconsin, and maybe we will talk about that later. But we immersed in rural Wisconsin and Iowa in 2017. And without getting into too much detail, part of what emerged for us through that work was that we just needed to bring people on airplanes across the whole country, to overcome perception gaps. And if we couldn't do that, and there's an organization, American Exchange Project, that is essentially playing out that stream of activity. But short of that, we needed storytellers, TV writers, and journalists to be able to act as societal mediators and translators, to be able to tell stories that could help us step into each other's worldviews and take proxy journeys. And so we shared that with Solutions Journalism Network, which is a great journalism organization. We ran a training for them, and that was one of the rocks that caused the avalanche that led into Amanda Ripley's Complicating the Narratives work. She participated in that very first training.
Yeah, which is really just extraordinary. And actually, we're right now we're meeting with a group of bridge builders in Boston, and David McCullough and American Exchange are part of that meeting.
Oh,
so
wonderful.
It's really actually I'll try to pop the link into the chat so that folks can folks can check that out as well. So just as a reminder, you can pop your questions into the Q&A anytime you'd like. And, you know, as we continue the conversation, we'll entertain some of those. So what does your methodology look like?
So I'll start at high altitude again, and then we can get into some examples. But we draw primarily from mediation frameworks, and we focus on interventions that help people to overcome core tendencies of conflict, and then maximize the likelihood that people are going to be able to connect and learn and collaborate even while directly investigating strong differences. So what are those core tendencies of conflict? And there's a lot of research and practice about this at both interpersonal levels and collective or even societal levels. There's three broad tendencies, one of which is self-absorption. When confronted with threat, we tend to get closed off and impervious, sometimes to the experience of the person sitting right before us, even if a moment earlier we were connected, even if we love that person very much, let alone if they're a societal other. We tend to get more rigid. We dig in, we become kind of the opposite of the receptive people and the flexible people that we are when we're most at ease. And we tend to get more reactive, and we play out that reactivity sometimes in different ways, through getting shut down, through getting aggressive. But many people are internally experiencing, however they're playing it out, a sense of being overwhelmed and out of control and being thrown off balance and stuck. So polarized social conflict kind of reproduces these tendencies systematically. We get echo chambers, which is a collective corollary of self-absorption, and we get intensified confirmation bias and litmus tests for ideological purity, which are some of the collective corollaries of rigidity. And people just start dismissing sources of evidence and entire groups of people that aren't already part of their prior knowledge. The heart of our methodology is a series of interventions and actionable tools, like very practical tools and skills that are kind of studied ways of moving people from self-absorption to reconnection and recognition, from rigidity to flexibility, and from reactivity to a greater sense of centeredness. So we call those shifts restabilization collectively. And essentially, like, we're training our facilitators and we're designing our processes to produce stability proactively in a room, and then to restore it when it's undermined. Like, one way to think about this is, we don't use a lot of ground rules. We don't talk about empathy or curiosity in terms of like asking that of people. We try to produce the conversational conditions in which those things just flow organically between people, because of the moves that the facilitators are making, and because of the ways that we've designed the space. So that even in the face of passionate disagreement, the participants are as generous toward each other and connected to each other as possible, then we've maximized the likelihood that they will take each other in and get to good outcomes of strengthened relationship and learning and problem solving. So, yeah,
go ahead. Keep going.
I was just going to say, of course, the $1 million question is how, right? Like, how do you produce stability among parties that might have entered a room diametrically opposed and afraid of each other and estranged? There's many answers to that question, but I will say, if I had to distill our facilitation model into 5 steps, it would be, we work to draw out what's most meaningful to parties in the room. So unearth it, bring it into the room. We call that following the meaning. We make sure that what matters to disparate parties is rightly understood. And this is simple and critical and very hard to achieve. But we work to ensure that everybody around a table is seen as they wish to be seen, and that has been proven, that we get it. That's true in our ground game. It's also true in air game. Like, we tell TV writers their content needs to kind of ensure that every audience member who could be watching it is seen as they wish to be seen, seen as they see themselves. We work to connect what matters most to disparate parties to each other. And then, as part of that process, we go toward and name and investigate differences rather than toward common ground, which I know is something that you wanted to talk about tonight, or I think it's one of the things that you mentioned.
Yeah. So So you talk about going toward the heat rather than pushing towards agreement and common ground. Explain why that?
So one of the big inspirations for our work is a school of mediation called transformative mediation that observes that paradoxically, when core differences are present, we're going to get better outcomes when we go toward them directly rather than sidestepping them or redirecting parties toward common ground. And the field of transformative mediation emerged in response to other forms of mediation that were preoccupied with brokering deals, with getting to yes, so to speak, and that often ended with a lot of issues that are important to parties being left unspoken and unaddressed and unacknowledged, and often people feeling pressured toward outcomes with which they themselves weren't happy. So going toward differences kind of runs against a dominant current in our field, and it's common to hear people talking about how connection across differences and reducing conflict means emphasizing similarity or requires it, and seeking common ground. And I think it'd be helpful to expand here, like actually quite a bit, and to give a couple of different approaches.
Sounds great.
And say it again.
Sounds great. Yes.
Okay, you're inviting more. All right. So I'll set up a kind of contrast between a common ground and a conflict transformation approach. And this isn't an either or in theory or in practice. Like many practitioners, including us, draw from these approaches in combination. But they do inspire really different moves in both theory and action. So a common ground approach tends to generally orient programs toward a discovery of what we hold in common or toward simple human connection. And the logic tends to be, if we table the hardest conversations and we get to know each other as people first over dinner, or by making a mural or a garden together, or I think you kind of referred to some of this earlier, right? Or by rolling up our sleeves and working together to make our communities better, we're going to more easily connect and be able to solve problems together. And then eventually, if we've built enough trust and we need to, we'll tackle the hard stuff. Eboo Patel, who is the founder and president of Interfaith America, has sometimes put it like, let's give up our obsession with the elephants in the room and we can appreciate all the other wonderful animals in the zoo. So this is an approach that is dominant, I think, in our space. A conflict transformation approach tends to see conflict not as a barrier that needs to be avoided, but as a springboard to what I've talked about tonight, deeper relationship learning and collaboration, if we engage it productively rather than destructively. So these are like very much complementary and not mutually exclusive paradigms. RTT's work sits more in a conflict transformation approach. And a few of the reasons that we do, when core differences are present, their destructive potential doesn't tend to go away until they're addressed. So this was really like one of the core observations of transformative mediation. And some of you may have experienced this in work you've been involved in, right? Like the coalition that comes together around the 80% that they agree on until the 20% can no longer be avoided. And then it threatens to undo everything that they've built. Or the group that's focused on interfaith relations that has a policy not to touch the Israeli-Palestinian conflict until a development on the ground makes that impossible. And then everything devolves. Another reason is that when differences are profound, and they're really important to us, encounters across difference can feel hollow and dissatisfying and sometimes even manipulative when we kind of circle around our differences rather than discuss them. And that can especially be true when conflicts have long histories and distrust is deep, or when people are genuinely fearful or upset. Encounters across differences can feel platitudinous rather than addressing what's most important to all parties. So in the Israeli-Palestinian peacebuilding space, this kind of work was parodied as eating hummus together and pretending nothing's wrong, right? And there was something that people talked about a lot, that there was this awareness that when there's so much anger and suffering and distrust, it can almost spark resentment for participants to have dinner together or build a house together, or even talk about how to solve cross-border water issues without also non-avoidantly just getting everything onto the table and talking about the hard stuff. And there's many reasons, but I'll throw one more onto the table, which is that Going toward differences rather than common ground can help us get past the self-selecting potential echo chambers of bridge building work itself. And this is this might be counterintuitive, but bridge building work can be its own self-selecting subculture, and it cannot reach the people who are most essential to be reached to be successful, we would argue, including people with passionate core convictions who have outsized influence on our conflicts and on our political culture, and who don't want to leave those core convictions at the door. Going towards differences rather than common ground is one of our answers to the question of how we get past the choir. It's something that I have been working on in one way or another for a long time, just bridging resistant people into the room. And, people will say, how did you get right-wing Orthodox Jews to be willing to sleep in Palestinian homes? How did you get Palestinians who don't believe in normalizing relationships with Israelis and Jews to buy in? How did you reach right-wing conservative evangelicals and progressive activists who have tremendous skepticism and distrust of this work? And going towards differences rather than common ground is one of the answers to that question. That was a very long answer to your question, but I hope
But a really
got a lot of
important
meaning
one.
on the table.
A really important one. So when you do that, then I assume that one of the things that happens then is that people really feel heard on their own terms and on the things that matter most to them.
Yes. So that is always steps 1 and 2, is ensuring that we have brought into the room what matters most to different people. And that means we're not steering towards people's mixed feelings, and we're steering towards their most passionate convictions. Like, that's what we want to bring into the room. We want to unearth it and excavate it, and then make sure that we're supporting the people in a conversation to take it in from each other. Either the facilitator's doing that, or they're building the skill in the room for people to do that with each other, and that they've all been rightly understood. Yeah. And then we move from there into naming differences and investigating them.
That what you said, that people are seen as they wish to be seen. That just seems so essential. And so much of the work that we do and that we see, I think that's not necessarily happening. That's hard.
Say more about what you mean that it's not happening. Where is it not happening?
I think that it's really, I think that it's such a consistent theme through our experience that people are not, I don't know, that there's still just a lot of assumptions being made that are not particularly accurate. And we see that all the time. And yet you said something actually interesting when we were talking about how very often there's a dynamic that if you kind of have a minority view, and if you go into a room where you are the minority view, then a lot of times the majority view sort of just overcomes it in a way that means that you haven't really been heard if you're in the minority.
Yes.
And I feel like I see that a lot.
Yeah, you're saying that you see that a lot, including in bridge building
in our work. Yeah,
in our work.
Yeah, I mean, because we can't always, we can't make it make audiences exactly even. Actually, Braver Angels has a red-blue rule, which I think is really interesting and seems to be pretty productive. But because we have big events for a large group of people, it's very hard for us to control that. And so if we, and where we're located geographically, our community leans left. And so probably there's going to be the majority view is going to lean left.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's, I would say in most bridge building spaces, people talk about this kind of white liberal problem, right? That you're going to walk into most bridge building spaces and find that 5 out of 40 people are people of color and 0 out of 40 voted for Trump. And as we see it, that is not a law of nature. It is a very surmountable problem, but it requires us making changes in our field to get there.
Yes, yes. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about putting a little bit more oomph under some of this. Let's talk about some of the questions around building bridges from skeptics. So why bother engaging with people with whom I disagree? What's wrong with polarization anyway? Some people say it's good for our differences to be sharpened.
Yes. So such a good question. And I think often the that idea of polarization as a good is coming from people on the left who see societal contentiousness as something that can drive important changes in society. And when we talk about toxic polarization, we're differentiating it from disagreement or just contentiousness. We're talking about the kind of whole conflict, high conflict runaway cycle of us, them, dehumanization that we've been talking about tonight, in which we see others as threats and enemies, and that then act accordingly, that produces all kinds of harms. In terms of the question of why bother engaging, that's actually a question that we love to ask people when we're in an interactive format, and we love to just kind of collect responses from different audiences about what they're experiencing as lost communally and personally and societally in the face of toxic polarization. And people, like, we found that actually less and less need of this on some level, because so many people today are experiencing like the costs and harms of polarization. They're experiencing harmed relationships and fractured communities, just this kind of brokenness, and 16% of Americans, I think it's actually now more, have stopped speaking to a close friend over politics, which is just staggering. Like, it means a loss of millions of relationships, tens of millions of relationships in this moment that we have an epidemic of loneliness in our country that's been found to cause all kinds of costs to our health and our democracy. Polarization just leads to cynicism and exhaustion and disengagement, with a lot of people putting their fingers in their ears and unplugging and checking out. David French had a powerful metaphor for this recently in an op-ed in the New York Times, where he talked about how Americans are becoming like jurors who've left the courtroom because they're so repelled by the lawyer's hostility, and then they have to return to make weighty decisions without any evidence. And
Oh, wow, that is great.
Yeah, it's a good one. I think we've talked about this a little bit, but not a lot, that we get erosions in democratic norms, and the conditions for political violence in America is just seeing pretty startling acts of and acceptance of political violence and harassment and threats. So we could talk much more about that. But just going back to kind of the engine for that question, I think when you were talking, and speaking more to people who see polarization as a driver for change, I think it's important to say that the work of dialogue is not meant to replace all the other tools in our toolkits. Like, it doesn't mean we stop championing or fighting for what we believe in. It means that we engage our counterparts alongside our other work, because doing so is going to make us more effective, on a micro level, because we better know how to frame issues we care about, to people who aren't our natural allies. And there's no change that's created without that. And on a macro level, because polarization is like the meta threat, the crisis that makes every other crisis worse. And it makes it that much harder to move any of our other agendas forward. I'll share one more thinker and metaphor. We've had a lot of metaphors, but we love the work of John Paul Lederach, who is a scholar and practitioner of conflict transformation and social change. And he has this great metaphor of how change happens, that it's like baking bread, and baking bread requires flour and yeast, right? And so the flour he compares to mass mobilization of the like-minded. And we need to create change, mobilize like-minded people, but that's never enough on its own. And social change also requires like that tiny ingredient of yeast. And often like the 40 people in a room is more important than all the people marching in the streets, especially when there's entrenched divisions. And that is about strange bedfellows coming together across their differences.
So do you have any red lines about who you won't work with to build relationships? And should I engage with people who deny my humanity, for example?
So that's a very important question. And I think actually there's two questions there. There's with whom do we have red lines? And then what would we say to people who are asking the question of should they have red lines? Should they talk to people denying their humanity? So, so at RTT, we don't advocate all dialogue with all people all the time, we'll say. There's a wide spectrum of comfort levels for who are each willing to engage and where we each draw our personal moral boundaries. And on one end, there's, another person who I know has spoken on UNUM, Daryl Davis. I saw he's spoken here, right? A Black man whose mission in life is to engage in direct dialogue with KKK members.
And maximally, yes. He goes right to the edge, right?
Right to the edge. And God bless him. And I am drawn to that edge as well. And we need people who are doing that. And we also don't expect everybody to go on that journey. Like if it feels that once humanity is at stake in a conversation, it is a lot to ask to extend oneself to achieve understanding for people on other sides of divides. And not every conversation and every table needs to be for everyone. So we sometimes reference an idea of informed consent of those who may experience most vulnerability at a given table, like clarifying whether this is something that they want to do with their energies and for their own purposes. And at the same time, we are just living in this cultural moment in which too many people are drawing their red lines very close to themselves. And we live in a moment, when premature dismissal of entire groups of people has become a kind of collective reflex, when so many of us harbor very limited understanding of the actual motivations and concerns of significant segments of other Americans. So when that becomes a societal pattern, it leads to all the harms and patterns that we've described.
That makes a lot of sense. And how about is what you do like both sidesism, mushy middle?
Yes. All right. You're bringing it all the voices of the skeptics in. It's good. So it is not both sidesism in the sense that we are not saying this is right and that is right, or these things are equally right. What we're trying to do is name differences and just crystallize them so that we can have an accurate understanding of where our differences actually lie. And then we can push and challenge each other. Like, this is not about singing Kumbaya and group hugs and just, riding off into the sunset together and pretending we don't have real differences, or setting aside our fundamental moral commitments in favor of some mushy middle ground. Like, it is about creating the conditions in which we can figure out where we actually diverge and who our counterparts actually are, and we can challenge each other and stretch each other's thinking so that we can. You want to jump in here?
Well, I was just saying, you're separating the signal from the noise. So now you're really talking about what the real difference is, yes, which is pretty important.
Exactly. So we're not just tucked in our echo chambers writing each other off.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm see a couple questions that are sort of on the conversation. One from Fred: please give an example of people being seen as they wish to be seen. And then Mark wants to know, can you describe a conversation between opposing sides that illustrates going towards difference? An example would make this more concrete.
Yes. So I'm going to take people into work that we're doing right now in Greater Buffalo. And this takes a little bit of contextualizing, but we are working to build lines of communication and collaboration across strong ideological and racial divides in Greater Buffalo. And Buffalo is a kind of microcosm for dynamics that go to the core of pain and division in the US. It's a meeting of red and blue America. It's a Rust Belt industrial city with strong working class roots, with a kind of narrative of being down on its luck and, the hope of making a comeback. And it's a city that is operating under the shadow of identity-based violence and political violence, a racially motivated grocery store massacre that shook the city to its core, that left the Black community in massive trauma and grief, and a lesser known firebombing of a pro-life pregnancy clinic. And there is just a history of political violence in Western New York. So we are doing work in Western New York that began working in affinity groups, because we thought that with the exceptional diversity of people that we were working with, that it would be harmful to throw everybody together And we are doing work initially. We were doing work initially. I'll describe 3 different rooms and then bringing them together. And that's the context for the moment that I'll share. So one room that consisted of Black and Brown community leaders and activists. And they're confronting their own differences around where does money go when it's invested in our community, and the generational divides that they have around those questions. We have another room of conservative evangelicals that goes right and righter. And they're talking about what role Christianity should be playing in American life and homeschooling their kids, and whether homeschooling is required to shelter their kids from harmful ideologies, right? These are very different rooms. And another room is multi-racial and multi-faith, Muslim, Jewish, mainline Protestant, smaller lines of difference. And they're talking about differences about cancel culture and policing and guns and immigration. And now we're bringing everybody together. So that's the kind of context for the moment that I'll share. So I think that there were 2 questions, one of which was about seeing people as they wish to be seen, and one of which was about going towards the heat, right? And I'm going to try to get at both of them in this example.
Yeah.
So this is a moment that I think shows both of those things, and also the ripples of doing so, which is why I want to share it. So there's a conservative evangelical white pastor, we'll call him Brett, and a Black progressive community leader, we'll call her Nicole. And they are doing an exercise in which they're practicing giving what we call a bullseye reflection, which means they're trying to reconstruct each other's thinking until they get to the point that they would both lean forward in their chair and say, yes, exactly, that's it. Like, you get me, you see what I think about what we're talking about. And what they're talking about is not the sexiest topic. They're talking about forgiveness of student loans. For various reasons, that's what had surfaced. So Nicole is listening to Brett talk about how student loans prioritize people who attend universities and get advanced degrees rather than people who attend trade schools. And he's saying, how can we be talking about forgiving loans for grad students when there's all these working people working their butts off? I think he probably said asses off. I don't know if I can say that in this right, but he said, there's all these people who are working their butts off, going to trade school and getting saddled with debt. And Nicole is saying to Brett, because of my grad student debt, I'm never going to be a homeowner. I will raise my kids in poverty. And I am a public figure in this county with a 6-figure salary because of accrued debt through grad student loans. There's always going to be a ceiling to my ability to lift my kids out of poverty. And that kind of debt disproportionately impacts communities of color. And they're kind of going after it for a while. And eventually he is like, I had no idea. And she is like, I've never thought about the thing that you're saying. And there kind of were tears in their eyes and tears of many people in the room. And it was emotional to see them achieving that kind of recognition. These are 2 people who were actually very resistant to having come on this journey with us, which is kind of part of the story. But really, what really struck us about this moment, and I think it's good to kind of talk about the bigger significance of it. So Brett does workforce development for a living, a lot of which happens in communities of color. And he kind of says out loud, like, I have never actually taken seriously enough intergenerational poverty in Black communities and its causes. And Nicole is the director for health equity for the county. And she says, I train my staff who work in multiple communities, but a big part of that work is in white rural communities. And I have never before this moment really taken seriously the economic impacts of inherited poverty on poor white folks who are stuck and unable to achieve economic mobility. And they kind of just like realize how each of them is missing huge things about populations they directly impact, and how they have these gaps in what they saw and understood that have real implications for the work that they're doing in the world, and how there's no way for that gap to be filled without relationship and difficult dialogue. And they see how their communities have been invisible to each other and how they're not able to achieve their vision or the kind of the work with which they've been entrusted as leaders without this moment of pushing and challenging each other, and how that's going to make their work better, and it's going to help their teams work better. It's going to help their organization systematically become better. It's going to make their community better. And this didn't come from them. This is more us at Resetting the Table reflecting on this moment afterwards. But we were thinking about how in America today, just entire populations are missing each other's perspectives, as we've been talking about. Economic strain in particular impacts so many different communities and is often just like very invisible. You know, it doesn't make front page news. It's not as sexy as a lot of other issues. And the communities that each of them, Nicole and Brett, what they represent, they've been pitted against each other. And they largely don't see each other's pain. And there's a whole political apparatus that says it's you or it's you, right? It's not both of you, it's not all of you. These kind of zero-sum games at play. And the simple act of kind of fearlessly surfacing, here's where we have a difference on student loans and not shrinking from the issues. And we're going to work at it till we reconstruct each other's thinking, witnessed by others in community, got them to see how they need each other's perspectives to make their community better.
That is a beautiful story. That's wonderful. So you and I have talked a fair amount about, I think, a common challenge that we've looked at, which is getting conservatives engaged in this work. This is a field-wide challenge, is that, you know, what you referred to a little bit earlier, that that a lot of liberals show up to do this work, and it's harder to get conservatives involved. So why should we do that? Why should we spend some extra time focusing on that goal?
Great question. Well, I'll say that we see that the scarcity of conservatives in the bridging sector as one of the greatest obstacles to our field achieving its goals. Like, it's really in the way of our work being successful. And, you know, we just won't mend the fabric of America with 50% of America. And it's not really just a numbers game. Like, we can get to tipping point without reaching everyone, but we won't get there by mobilizing relatively like-minded people. And the way that we think about this, it's not only about conservatives, it's about a lot of groups. It's about rural people and working class people and BIPOC people. And even it's about activists, right? Like, activists are underrepresented in our field for good reason. There's a lot of talk about mobilizing the reasonable middle, or the exhausted majority, or the hopeful majority, or the in-group moderates, and isolating the extremes. And from what we have seen and observed, like, that strategy writes off too many people who are would-be partners, and the very people that we need, because we need the most engaged and most passionate voices who are going to have outsized influence on our political culture involved. And that was, for me, one of the hard-won lessons of years of work in Israel-Palestine, that world became a shrinking subculture because it dismissed or didn't speak to enough the concerns and struggles of so many people who are passionately convicted.
And you had said something when we were chatting before, that very often things are set up in a way and in a language and with framing that is actually sending a clear message to some of the harder people to reach. This is actually not for you. You have to agree with us first about a bunch of things to even walk in the room.
Yes, that is very true. So now we're getting at the how, right? Not just the why. And, you know, sometimes I think people are very aware of this and they're really trying, but we fixate too much on individual words, right? Like, oh, well, I'll avoid saying that word because that word isn't going to resonate. And it's really so much bigger than that. And we've actually been reflecting on the question of how engage conservatives much more just in the last month. It's something that we haven't really talked about much publicly, but I'll try in this moment. So, because I think it's been a kind of under-acknowledged ingredient in our sauce and in our work that we haven't crystallized enough. So, so our thinking is,
and it's important maybe to say that you've had a tremendous success in this regard.
We have had success in this regard, and so we've been asking ourselves, how can we explain how we're doing that better and even understand it for ourselves, right? So, so I think the first step in it is deciding to do it. Like, you know, it goes back to what you were just asking about the why. You know, it's like there's a book called The Answer to How is Yes. And the reason I say that is because it's hard, actually. Like, it's not something that is easy or quick. It takes real investment in trust building and relationship building, and it's much easier and faster to create a self-selecting opt-in group. So first of all, we have to decide that it's worth it, and we're going to slow down in order to speed up, in order to ultimately produce more impactful outcomes. We have to identify and engage trusted messengers in the communities that we want to reach. Like, this is just absolutely essential to start with people who have social capital in those communities, who are looked to as exemplars. They don't need to be in positions of formal leadership. They do need to be respected and influential with their constituencies. Like, this is how our work in Buffalo began. We began by cold calling a very conservative white evangelical pastor and cold calling a very progressive Black pastor and community organizer who were connected to communities that were directly impacted by political and hate-fueled violence in Greater Buffalo. And they became the kernels of everything else that we did. We need to meet people where they are, and that's not just actually about framing. It's not about like what words we use in our flyers. It's I'll bring in some of the work that we did in rural Wisconsin now. So in that work, which involved bringing 36 facilitators and interns with us, most of whom were coming from deep blue enclaves. Like, they were coming from schools like Brown and UC Berkeley and Oberlin, into a context that, if you look at a map of the counties that swung Obama to Trump in the 2016 election, almost all of them are concentrated in this area, like really almost all of them. And we trained the people who came with us to do our first two skills, following the meaning and demonstrating understanding, right? Which means asking questions that draw out what's meaningful to people and capturing it. And to do it by meeting people where they are. We called this being in the mix. And I'll make this like very concrete. We found out what bars and what churches and hunting clubs and gun shops and farming organizations and community events, the people that we wanted to reach, frequent, and at what times of day they were there. And we listened and we built relationships. And we cold called 285 pastors and priests in 13 counties. And we asked them, we don't always have the luxury of doing this, but we asked them, many of them took our calls. We asked them how polarization was impacting them, was impacting their communities. And many of them not just took a call from a stranger across the country, they invited us into their churches and they lined up their congregants for us to sit and listen to them. And they were just so hungry to actually tell their story and have their flocks tell their story and be accurately heard, because they had felt enormously misrepresented and maligned. So listening well is a crucial part of this, asking people questions about what they care about and what they're afraid of and what they want.
And most of us do not listen well, correct?
It is another crucial part of our sauce. It's really like where we often start is by teaching listening skills, whether we're working with people who are coming together across ideological differences or working with TV writers. We start by teaching them how to listen to other people in the room, because that is how we unlock a lens, essentially, of being able to step into a different viewpoint and not just fill in all of our perception gaps with our implicit bias, essentially.
Which is what we humans do, right?
It's what we're hardwired for.
It's just a human thing.
Yes.
So I have got to read this question from Paul just as he wrote it, because it's good.
Okay.
Does transformative mediation require that participants enter the room with a heaping helping of goodwill already present in their hearts?
He's asking if it does require that goodwill?
Yes, yes.
Transformative mediation is actually like a very studied way of helping people who did not enter a room with goodwill get back to goodwill. Like, that's how I would put it. And one of the things that transformative mediation observed is that when people are in conflict and they turn to a mediator for help, they're turning to a mediator for help more often because they want to get out of the ugly experience of being in conflict and how horrible it is, than because they want the mediator to help them get to shared interests. And when the mediator can help them relax and lower their defenses and be in their best selves and be as generous and receptive to each other as possible, they're going to be able to get to the outcomes that they themselves seek, rather than the mediator pushing them there.
Yeah, that's great. So we touched on this. I guess I just want to see if there's anything else that you want to say regarding it. Is you know, are there specific lessons that sort of came directly from the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that you see playing out in the United States now?
That's a big one. Yes. I think that the first thing that comes to mind to say, you know, when we pivoted, we saw a lot of indicators, as I said earlier, of intractable conflict here. One of those was this kind of secessionist fantasy that happened after the 2016 election in liberal America, like this kind of fantasy of, could we just get a red state, blue state divorce? You know, like, would we be better off if they just went away? So I think that one of the lessons of working on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the danger and fallacy of pro-Israel or pro-Palestinian, we win or they do, zero-sum thinking, like we are all here to stay, Republicans and Democrats and everybody else, and there's no total defeat. In a true democracy by definition, and that means we are each other's only possible partners in building a better future. And we have to act as if that's the case, right? As the great Dr. King put it, we're going to live and rise together or perish as fools. So I would say that's lesson one. You know, there's a lot I could say here, but one way to look at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is as a tragic dance of cause and effect of actions and reactions between two parties who believe that the other is kind of single-mindedly out to get them, and who as a result create a lot of harm and escalation in the name of self-protection that feed right into each other's worst perceptions. And it's less about borders and Jerusalem and water and refugees and all these technical issues that it looks like it's about. It is much more about trust and recognition. Like, do I believe that they will recognize my legitimacy or my historical dispossession? Will they stop at nothing until they've taken all we have? Will they never accept our right to be here? Will they only listen to force? Will they give with one hand and take with the other? You know, and would they destroy us if they could? And if so, then how could I trust enough to contemplate giving an inch that would weaken my position or be used against me?
And also, I'm going to do anything necessary to protect myself if that's how it feels, which then
Yes.
becomes part of the escalation, right? That
Yes.
then, you know, one side, I mean, I think one of the things that's frustrated me through these years of this work is how often we fail to recognize a cycle we're stuck in, and where our behavior then creates behavior on the other side, us behavior, then them behavior, and then it just keeps spiraling in a destructive cycle.
Yes. And that is the tragedy, the attack and defend cycle. And, you know, we're not at that level of an escalation and entrenchment and violence, obviously, here. And, you know, I do hesitate to make comparisons too closely, but I think that there's something illuminating about looking at polarization in the US as a conflict cycle in the same way, and like looking at issues of trust and distrust and misrecognition as like we've been saying is more at play than differences on interests and policies. And you know, 80% I think of Americans now say that leaders and members of the other party are a threat to the country, right? And like there's just this belief that like they're going to take away my rights and freedoms. And there's valid reasons and histories for these beliefs, as in all conflict cycles. Like and our differences in the US are real, but more than policy differences, we just have these fundamental issues of distrust and contempt that mean that we're fighting the boogeyman version of our counterparts, which in turn feeds bunker mentalities and arms race mentalities and escalation.
Well, it seems like it's easy to assume that the dangerous, serious escalations that, you know, we see in the Middle East are an other problem, right? It's something that happens somewhere else between other people. And so to me, part of what's instructive is that it's important to know that these are conditions that can exist that are human conditions that can exist between any us and them, anywhere. And that to be able to understand and study it so that we know some of the right things to do instead of, seems like we are pretty good at doing the wrong things sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So I'm looking at some of the other questions. I'll grab a couple of them. Kami Akavan is a colleague of ours, USC Center for the Political Future. Of all the solutions to deep social division that you think work best, which ones do you think is the most important, impactful scale and the most likely to achieve in the United States? And how can we support your recommendation for the most impactful and realistically achievable solution to polarization in America?
Ooh, that's a doozy.
Big question.
Yes, big question. So we try to steer clear of kind of most important because I said earlier, we don't think there's a silver bullet. Like there are so many interventions that are needed. I will say that one of the things that is really needed, we talked about the scale of what was achieved in Northern Ireland, $44 a person. And I think philanthropists in the US kind of balk at that, like what that would mean to invest at that level in the US in intergroup contact and intragroup norm building. And that may be what we need to get to a tipping point. We just need massive investment on that level, which probably will require also government investment. Some of my friends in the Israeli-Palestinian peace building field worked for years to get Congress to invest $250 million in Israeli-Palestinian peace building. And tragically, a lot of that work was just kind of coming to fruition before October 7th. But that meant that just incredible initiatives were being funded at the level at which will be needed to move the needle there, right? People, bereaved families who've lost immediate loved ones to the conflict, getting the funding that they need to help amplify their incredible voices that can model and shift consciousness. And Israeli and Palestinian surgeons who are working together, Gazan surgeons and surgeons in Southern Israel that are working together, and also modeling the voices that we need. So that work is being invested in from the US government, and we need that level of investment here. I'll say one other thing that's coming to mind. This is kind of nerdy, but we'll geek out for a moment. That one of the things that I think will help get to that investment is building an evidence base around our field. But when we talk about evidence base, a lot of what tends to be talked about is practitioners implementing researchers' principles and assumptions. And I think that we're at a point in which practice has outstripped the ability to measure it. And that part of what we need is for researchers to be researching what's working well among practitioners and learning how to measure it. So it's kind of like, in the medical field, when there was people finally started taking seriously that acupuncture and meditation and things like that work, and measuring it and trying to understand it and understand its mechanism. So I think we need researcher practitioner partnership, and that's part of the picture.
Wow, that's incredibly smart. And we've been doing a lot of work in the measurement space, and actually we've got our skim tool and everything, but that makes so much sense. We only have so much time. We need to zero in on what is actually working. From Cheryl, with a relatively short time before us in this election year, is there anything non-facilitators, regular Americans can do to help us move out of this conflict cycle?
There are so many things that regular Americans can do. So the first thing that comes to mind is to start with ourselves. Like, we can do a self-inventory of our own bubbles and just insist on getting out of them, like pursuing the perspectives we don't yet understand. And at RTT, every individual on our team does this. We're asking ourselves all the time, whose voices don't I yet understand? And what can I read? And who can I talk to? Who is and isn't informing my thinking? And I love, I'll reference Daryl Davis again, like his beautiful imagery of choosing to walk across the cafeteria and leave our comfort group and sit at someone else's table. Like, just let listening pull us out of our small worlds and enlarge our humanity. I heard someone say recently, and I wish I could quote it in someone's name, but I don't remember who said it, but they were talking about how media literacy is not only about catching misinformation, it's also about catching misrepresentation, which I really love. And like, we have to do that self-inventory and get out of our bubbles to be able to do this. But I just love seeing people who've come through bridge building programs begin to adopt what we call a multivocal lens, because people start living inside their brains, lots of different kinds of people, and then they can catch bias and blind spots in media stories in a way that they never could before. And then they become much less manipulated and much less reactive to the online machinery of anger. We've talked about what we call bullseye reflections, and bullseye reflections, meaning like working to reconstruct someone else's thinking until they say, yes, exactly, that's me. By the way, we describe how to make a bullseye reflection in our free downloadable discussion guide that accompanies Purple. And so you can read about this skill and put it into practice. And it's really like, we think of it as the sit-ups, that help us run, like, get into the Olympics. It's like we can just do this all day long. We can practice with everybody in our lives. We can practice it with a conversation that we've been avoiding, that we want to attempt, or a conversation that went poorly that we want to try again. We can take someone out for coffee with whom we disagree and work at it, and work at capturing someone's thinking and be correctable and ask for feedback and keep working at it until somebody would say, yes, exactly, that's me. Like, that's how we're going to get to that point of having lots of different voices inside of us.
And so maybe not only will we heal our division, but we'll also have better marriages, better relationships with our friends and our children.
Yes.
That's good. So a comment from Cheryl Gravy from National Institute for Civil Discourse. She said that she learned from you years ago about leaning into fear as a place of learning, and it stayed with her all these years. And then distilling a number of different questions. When you look at what's happening right now on campus, what are we missing? What should be happening maybe that isn't happening? And I know that you don't know, specific situations, but if you could wave a magic wand, what is one of the things that you would add that would help get us on a path?
So what's happening on campus is heartbreaking, and we're importing the worst of Israel-Palestine. So there's so many things that I could say here. My mind is going in multiple directions, but one thing that I'll say is that in conflict engagement work, there's a lot of different kinds of work that's needed. We need prevention work, de-escalation work, repair work, and transformation, so that we don't get into the same place. So we at Resetting the Table tend to focus much more on prevention and repair and transformation than we do on de-escalation. Like, we are less the firefighters and less the EMTs and more the physical therapists who kind of come in to rehabilitate, and the personal trainers that try to prevent things from getting to that point to begin with, and the surgeons that kind of piece things back together. And so a lot of what we think prescriptively is about what needs to happen in a whole campus way to prevent this level of escalation when it becomes very hard to intervene. And I'll give a shout out to some other organizations in the field, like when we're talking about prevention and whole campus approaches, Interfaith Work America and Constructive Dialogue Initiative have kind of great reports and write-ups of what's needed in a whole campus sense. And we need kind of that top-down approach and also a bottom-up approach. And Bridge USA is also doing like wonderful work with students that's bottom-up. We're focused on one particular intervention that's our sweet spot, and that is training administrators and faculty and staff to kind of re-socialize the entire staff and student body to be able to productively engage across differences. That needs to be built into first-year orientations. It needs to be built into faculty onboarding so we get a different kind of culture. on campus. In terms of de-escalation, because I think I'm probably speaking to the side of what is on a lot of people's hearts and minds. And there are so many things that are needed here too. I will say that on the campuses where the administration built lines of communication early and often and ongoingly with the activists on all sides, there was much less boiling over than there is in this moment. Once we get to this moment, very little can happen in public. Like almost anything that can happen needs to happen behind closed doors and quietly, because not just statements, law and order, right? All these responses, right? All of these responses are going to just be like blood in the water, attracting the sharks. A friend of mine, Mickey Bergman, is a hostage negotiator. This like one of the foremost hostage negotiators in the U.S. and people can read his book. He's been involved in hostage negotiations in North Korea and Cuba and Lebanon and Iran. And this may feel like a detour, but one of the things that Mickey will say is like hostage negotiation requires like stepping into the lens of the person that you're negotiating with. And that's very different than agreement or validation, but we need people who are kind of negotiating with all sides and being able to be able to say to people who are fomenting this level of conflict at this point, like we see and understand where you're coming from and why, and then work with them.
That just makes so much sense. So much sense. And also just the concept that so much of this work is preventative, that you have to like exercise. It's like a muscle. You can't just let it sit there and then expect it to be good for when you need it.
Exactly. Yes.
We're about to close tonight. So what I want to do is find where we've got like a post event evaluation, and we're going to throw that into the chat window before I ask the last question or two of the evening. If you can take just a second while we're finishing up to answer those questions, we will be grateful. For it to be science and for us to understand our programs, we need to have both a pre and a post. So if you did the pre, if you can do the post, and you'll be eligible to have a chance to win a $100 gift card. So we're popping that into the chat. And so what I wanted to ask you is two things. First is, how can people engage more with you and with resetting the table?
So people can, especially I would say in the sectors that are our areas of focus, faith communities, faith-based organizations, higher ed, entertainment, journalism, reach out about working together. You can reach us at info@resettingthetable.org. And even if you're not in one of those sectors, if you think that we can be helpful, we will try to connect you to other organizations that can be helpful if we can't be. You can show Purple, the film that Village Square has circulated, and use our DIY guide that accompanies it as a tool to practice skills for collaborative communication across divides, whether with a group of 400 people at a time or with 4 people with a group of friends. We didn't talk a lot about social media tonight, but one of the things that everybody can do is follow the people that are in our space, hashtag disagree better, listen first, and amplify the voices of people in our space. And LinkedIn is our platform of choice. You can find lots of opportunities that we post there, as well as ways that we're telling our story.
Can get as addicted to social media as they want, as long as it's in the bridge building space. So my last question is this: what gives you hope, Melissa?
Well, polarization and destructive conflict tend to produce fatalism and despair. One of the things I think I find most hopeful in our work over the years is seeing how quickly that fatalism gets undone. And, whether that's Berkeley and Brown students sitting down with Trump supporters without college degrees in rural Iowa, or rabbinical students sitting down with Palestinian grassroots activists. Like, one of the visceral impacts is restored hope. That's kind of restored hope in humanity and in getting past conflict and in our capacity to build a life together. And I've often just gotten to have a front row seat to thousands of people being reinitiated into a sense of possibility, like being reluctant and scared and angry and skeptical and estranged and taking in each other's perspectives. Eyal likes to say the sky didn't fall, but the earth cracked open. And that is what this work is, in its best moments. Like, people just have so much to say to each other when they're supported to do so. And skeptics might say that, we can't scale that, or we can't sustain that, or make it sticky. But I just discovered a wonderful anthropologist, Douglas Fry, who works closely with Peter Coleman and studies how peace systems work. And one of the things that he says is, like, huge changes are just really the rule, not the exception in human history. And things that people thought would never change have, right? The emergence of the European Union after decades of world wars and the decimation of a continent and more than 100 million lives lost. Just the immensity of the changes that have occurred in human history and can take place in the human future is huge. So that is something that gives me hope. And if I know we're a minute over, I'm going to quote one more thing, if that's okay. So I just heard an Israeli peacemaker talking about how hope is an action. Like, it's not something that you feel, it's something you do. And it's like love, like it's something we have to do together, right? Like, we don't do hope alone, it's something we make together. And I heard a Palestinian peacemaker say in response, like, to hope is just to keep going and to stay together while we do it, like knowing that even when there's no immediate foreseeable horizon, that we're doing, or the work that we're doing is building the infrastructure on which a joint life will be built when it's possible. So may we keep going. May we do it together. May we be the human infrastructure, the human bridges on which a shared life will be built.
So it seems like it's becoming somewhat of a tradition when I facilitate these programs that at the end, our special guests make me cry, and in a good way, in a hopeful way. So you did it again. That was just incredibly beautiful. And additionally, just I learned so much from you during this program. I'm so grateful to you for spending time with us. I know that that our audience learned as well. And I hope that, I don't know, maybe we can get it out to all 330 million of us, and we'll be good. So thank you so much for being with us tonight, Melissa. And on behalf of Florida Humanities, the Village Square, and the rest of our streaming partners, we'd like to thank you for joining us tonight. Good night, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much.